Well, I appreciate you guys being on tonight, and the purpose of this call is just to get us all, number one, to get us all together, and number two is to give you a little overview of the communications program, where we fit in, what we're trying to accomplish and do, the mechanics of the actual down to earth mechanics of communications emergency plan. Really, that happens in each of the wards and the branches where the mechanics of that happen. But we're going to talk about principles and the why. Why are we doing this, and how everything fits together with that. I found this little cartoon. I thought it was pretty cute. But in reality, I started thinking about it. Noah, he experienced the biggest disaster we've ever seen, and that's ever been here on the earth. And he was prepared. And there were many that didn't listen, and few that did, and they weathered the storm. Well, we're not unlike that today. I think we've heard from prophets a number of times, and some have listened and some have not. We're valiantly trying to help people listen and to be prepared. So the church has developed this website, providentliving.lds.org. It's got a great a large amount of information about how do you build a plan, how do you do a plan. And I handed a packet out to bishops that took a lot of information from here, but this is where that's at. Again, a lot of resources. We're going to look at just part of it, and that has to do with communications. But this thought of be thou prepared and prepare thyself, thou and all thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. That's really what we're doing. And so in looking at this emergency preparedness planning guide that the church has the guidelines they've given us on the Provident Living website, what they're trying to accomplish in this guide are these 5 steps. First is identify likely disasters, and then gather critical information, and then outline assignments and procedures, identify emergency communication methods, encourage member participation in that. And like I said, we're going to focus on the emergency communication planning part of things. This plan should ensure that the church leaders can do the following. Number 1, contact missionaries and all members following a disaster. Determine the condition and potential impact on members and their homes, missionaries, church property, and the community. And I thought it's interesting, the inclusion of the community. And over the last little while, I've really realized the value of including the community in that. Report the status of missionaries, members, buildings, and other necessary information to the Area 70 or church headquarters, and coordinate church relief efforts. So that's what we're trying to accomplish with the communication plan. And then requesting the needs and the needed response of supplies and volunteer services. We've got to have communication to do that. So what's the process? This is the church's emergency response communication protocol in terms of an area made up of a number of different stakes. So it begins with the stake president. President Ennis will collect the information from the bishops, and he compiles that, and then he will get that information out to the Area 70s, the area welfare manager up in Hermiston, and then it makes its way up to the presiding bishopric, Quorum of the 12. We also include down here the state volunteer organizations, community organizations, because that's part of that. You remember that other part had included the community, because many times we'll support the community, and also we seek the support from the community as well in a lot of the services that the community provides. So in putting this together, we have that area plan, but how do we get that information to the stake president? And that's where we have a ward, the bishop, a branch president, who gets information from the elders quorum president, relief society president, via ministering members who have contacted members and neighbors within geographic areas. So that's the crux of what we're trying to accomplish and do, is get that information flow to go upstream. I had the opportunity to visit with a bishop down in Northern California, and in his ward, they've dealt with floods, they've dealt with earthquakes, and last summer they dealt with fires. And in having the opportunity to visit with him, I asked him, well, how did you contact everybody, and what was the length of time it took you? How long did it take you to contact these people? And he said, well, it probably took us, within 8 hours, we had everybody accounted for within his ward. Now, it's interesting, he told me the profile of his ward. His ward is 35 miles long. It runs up and down a highway. And yet he was able to accomplish that in 8 hours. So I said to him, Bishop, that's amazing. How did you do that? And he said, well, we used phones when the phones worked. And then we got in our cars and we drove. We got on bicycles and pedaled. We put our boots on and walked. We did whatever it took to make the contacts. And it was just that determination to get out and do that. And then I said, well, how did you have your ward organized that you were able to do that? And he said, well, we've been through several disasters. And then he named off the things that they've been through in the last few years. And he said, we learned the importance of doing some things geographically and having things organized geographically. And we learned the importance of communications and being prepared to accomplish the objectives and being comfortable with what we've done. And so with that, I kind of picked up on, we need to identify our communication methods. So what methods are there that we can communicate? And the key things here are church leaders, they've got to have open lines of communication. So we have to be familiar with that. And we also have to have a plan for alternative communication methods. So what if the phones are down? What if the power is down? And how do we work in those circumstances? Self-service goes down when we have a big duck game sometimes. During the ice storms, we knew about power grids. In fact, it was interesting talking with some of those that are involved in emergency management for Eugene. I was talking with a person there, and she said, one of our main concerns is the vehicle transportation routes. 90% of our fuel comes from Portland, and our food comes down the freeway. That one freeway, I-5, and the stores have 3 days worth of food. So there's not a whole lot to fall back on. There's not a lot of stores or food stores that are available. So the value of being prepared is huge, and they recognize that. Internet communications, that's data. Data works many times better than voice. Voice will be one of the first things to go. So we still can use internet via email, social media, instant messaging in many circumstances. Text messaging. And I don't know if you remember or you've had the experience of you're running down. I got 3 bars, 2 bars, 1 bar is starting to flutter. You can't make the call, but you can send a text message. Amateur radio, big one, and we'll watch a little video about amateur radio. But that is a big issue because you're not relying on infrastructure when you're dealing with that. Personal contact, walking, cycling, just doing what you need to do to make it happen. So then we look at the backup communications. If our majors are out, and again, back to amateur radio, it's been around for a long time. It's the fallback every time. And again, we'll watch a little video that shares a little bit more about amateur radio. Internet-based communications, they can work. It's a backup method. And then there's the local short-range communications, your handheld radios. two-way radios. You know, you have FRS and GMRS radios. Some of the radios are combined where they have the FRS frequencies and the GMRS frequencies. GMRS generally has a little bit more power to it, a little bit more wattage behind the radios. Though when you get a radio and it says that it's good for 30 miles, you count on a mile to a mile and a half or 2 miles. 30 or 35 miles is when there's a perfect circumstances, weather's good, you have direct line of sight and all that. But still, you think of the geography of where you're at and how you're going to communicate and the areas that you're going to communicate in, and you know these little the handheld radios can work well, you know, with a mile distance between the radios. And again, they're not dependent on any particular infrastructure. And same I neglected about the CB radios. Kind of the same thing. You're using something that's not dependent on infrastructure. Satellite phones, I just had put a little piece in here about satellite phones. They're reliable and available at some of the Bishop storehouses, but they're expensive to own, they're expensive to maintain, and they are prone to overload in a large-scale disaster. So just a little note on those. We're going to watch this FEMA administrator talks about amateur radios and the use in a disaster. And see if I can get this going here. And if you're not muted,
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
That'd be great.
Craig Fugate has a long resume. Because his time is short, I'm not going to read his resume, but we are very privileged to have him here with us today. And let me say this, he oversees 3,700 employees, another 4,000 that look after us, prepare for disaster, respond to disaster. A great deal of pleasure that I get to introduce to you today, Mr. Craig Fugate, Administrator of FEMA. Thank you, sir.
I hit 4 broad areas because I think, you know, we talk about communications and we talk about the public. Oftentimes, I almost get a sense we pit one against the other in how we describe things. You know, I think we talk a lot about social media at the expense of the broadcasters. I think we talk a lot about public safety communications, but then we come back to broadband. And then there's one group that we never talk about, but they're the ultimate backups, and they were the originators of what we call social media, and that's the amateur radio operators. So, yeah, you guys are here. I've got to come back to amateur radio. The initial communications out of Haiti, some of the communications at various parts, and we go back and forth across these disasters, is volunteers using assigned frequencies that they're allocated, their own equipment, their own money, nobody pays them. We're the first ones oftentimes getting word out in the critical first hours and first days as the rest of the systems came back up. And I think that there's a tendency that because we have done so much to build infrastructure and resiliency in all of our other systems, we have tended to dismiss that role when everything else fails. Amateur radio oftentimes is our last line of defense. And I think at times we get so sophisticated and we have gotten so used to the reliability and resilience in our wireless and wired and our broadcast industry and all of our public safety communications that we can never fathom that they'll fail. They do, they have, they will. I think a strong amateur radio community that's plugged into these plans, you know, most of the time they're going to be bored because there's not a lot they're going to be doing that people aren't doing with Twitter and Facebook and everything else. But when you need amateur radio, you really need them. So 4 broad areas, all equally important, all key to one mission, and that is meeting the needs of survivors and helping them deal with the challenges that they face.
So he kind of put it together, didn't he? It was the value of having amateur radio operators is big. I need to just read this just on the church's policy for equipment. wards and stakes should not purchase or accept donated satellite telephone or amateur radio equipment for use in an emergency or for installation in a meeting house. However, leaders are encouraged to identify individuals who may already have their own equipment to assist with specific ward and state communication needs. No permanent installation of equipment, including antennas, is to be made in any church meeting house. Exceptions must be approved by the Meeting House Standard Plans Committee. So I just needed to kind of connect with that. I've had a couple questions on that as well, and that answers pretty well. So the other thing in terms of amateur radios and the community is coordinating with the community. Communication with our local agencies and community officials and leaders, I'm learning is vital, because there are a lot of resources that they have to offer to us as well as we to them. Evacuations, sheltering activities, medical support, donations, and other volunteer management. Those are some things that we need to communicate with them, and they're operating on the amateur radio frequencies. And being able to accomplish and do that and meet with them. In fact, I had a meeting here the other week with the Springfield City Management, Emergency Management team, and we talked about our plans as a stake and their plans as in the city, and how we can meld that together, how we can be of assistance with them, and how they can help support us. It was a good conversation. I probably spent near an hour with them. And then as to what can the church do to help in the community, which we've heard many of the stories of how we work within the community and we can benefit the community that way as well. Some areas of concern that have come up in discussions with several of you and with other leaders is trained communication operators, amateur radio operators. How many do we have in the stake that are trained? We maybe have 8 or 9 at the most. We have several that are involved in taking classes or are in the process of getting their license. We've got a couple of wards that are pretty broad that are very limited with their operators that are available. And so we need to we need to add some people to that and help promote that. I look at those that are broad. If you have an amateur radio operator on one side, how are you going to get the information for the ward to the bishop and then get that information to the stake president? And that's part of that communication plan to develop that. So important to kind of look at strategically how are you going to do that. Two-way radio communications, that may be an answer. It's a little easier. Doesn't quite take the same licensing to do that. But it's still, with two-way radios, being comfortable with the radio, understanding how to use it, knowing who has the radios and who can use them. Trained emergency disaster response personnel. Community emergency response teams, and I'm going to have Miriam talk about that in a minute. Those that are first responders within a ward. EMTs, other medical professionals. It's just valuable to have these people that are trained, that understand how to respond in a disaster. I'm going to give Miriam just a minute here, if I can get my thing here. Miriam, are you unmuted now?
I am. I unmuted myself.
Okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. Why don't you just take a minute and share with us, you've been taking the CERT class put on by Eugene Springfield Fire Department. Share with us just the impact that's had so far, what your expectations are, and a little bit more about CERT and who they, about it and what a CERT does.
Well, I've CERT has been on my radar for quite a while, which stands for the Community Emergency Response Team, and I've been wanting to participate. They have here in the Eugene Springfield area, they do 2 trainings a year, one in the fall and one in the spring, and it's free, which is pretty awesome. And I've been participating with you, Brother O'Connor. And basically, we've got 4 filled Saturdays of learning. This last Saturday, we learned triage and disaster psychology, and we've been learning, oh gosh, there's so much information, but most of everything is geared towards having you and your family be able to shelter in place in case of a disaster. And then after you take care of yourself, then you're able to reach out to your community members. And so that's what I've been most interested in, is being able to know how to handle the different situations and know what resources our community has. And they have it very well put together. And I've been really impressed thus far, and encourage everybody to, if you have a chance, to participate.
What has that done in terms of your confidence levels in an emergency?
It's gone way up. Stress levels down in the thought of, if there's a disaster to come, I don't need to stress about it. I know what I need to do in order to help my family be safe and to be able to help out in the community, because we know that when something like that happens, it's if you can help, it's good to help as many as you can. And
it's been a great experience for me as well. I've said it several times to a number of people, but we went out and we used a fire extinguisher. I'd never used a fire extinguisher before, and thinking of using a fire extinguisher in an emergency and never having used one was a little intimidating. We went out, shot it. It probably took a couple of seconds to use that. My confidence level shifted dramatically in being able to just use a fire extinguisher. If I see one, I know what to do. I understand more about that. The stress level is relieved. My confidence level increased substantially. And so you can imagine, if you're in a disaster, things are happening, what do? You've got 30 seconds to make a decision and to act on something. Now we know what to do with things. So great experience. Thank you, Miriam. I appreciate you taking a few minutes with that and sharing that. So we're able to look at how can we first have the confidence level to impact our family, then our neighborhood, our church, and community. So the idea is to help us be prepared, but not just with food and those kind of things, but in understanding what to do in service to others. There's a difference between home storage and emergency preparedness. Being able to be totally prepared is a good thing, and not just have food to go cook on your barbecue. So hopefully tonight we've been able to give you an overview of kind of an emergency plan, what's going on, what do we need to do. I will say that it's just extremely important to just get with your ward and those that are in your ward to work on that plan. And you guys that have the radio experience and other kinds of experience can have some good input in establishing those plans. And we encourage the bishops to use as many resources as you can in making that plan and in considering the plans. I'm available to come in and do some things in different wards and help where I can, and I'm more than happy to do that. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to play a video. It's a trailer for the Oregon Unprepared. It's about 6 minutes long, and that should take us up to our time. But it just lets us know what are we up against. If you haven't seen it, it's a great one. If you go to if we time out before that, it's posted on a YouTube playlist. Robert O'Connor Emergency Preparedness. Type that in the search bar on YouTube, and you'll get a playlist of a number of videos, which includes the full version of Oregon Unprepared. And some other emergency videos. So we'll let me get out of this, see if I can get that video going. Come on here, buddy.
The tsunami has engulfed several cities in Miyagi Prefecture.
What happened in Japan is a good analogy of what has happened here in the past and can happen again.
Debris piles in the background.
This is an example of, unfortunately, what Oregon has to look forward to. This is not a fantastical theory of the future. This is going to happen soon. You can imagine a big conveyor belt of the Juan de Fuca plate is under here, and where they're locked together, you're deforming the whole North American plate, and this is
The current research puts the odds of having an 8 or 9, a Cascadia event, at about 37% chance in the next 50 years. Call that 1 in 3. These things not only happen here, they happen here regularly.
The risk here is extreme. This is about the worst soil in Portland we could have built on. 90-some% of our fuel comes right through this area.
Achilles heels infrastructure, without question. We expect to have a lot of bridge and road failure. People may not be able to communicate with each other. I worry most because I think people will not understand when there's no shelter, there's no food, there's no water. We've just been behind the ball for so many years, so we're playing catch up. We're not as prepared as San Francisco, Los Angeles. I don't sleep well at night.
An ancient tsunami that inundated this valley 1,000 years ago flooded all the way up to this point. The tsunami picked up sand from the beach and nearby dune. It's a record of that tsunami. No one could outrun it.
When the earthquake happens, the big magnitude 9, and the wave shows up in about 20 minutes, you've got thousands of people all along this waterfront here that would have to realize that they're at risk and would have to start moving.
I guess if I were to have to give Oregon a grade in our preparedness, if this were to happen tomorrow, I think we would probably be below C.
We're doing a post-earthquake drill. We get dispatched to go out to do a rapid evaluation of all the bridge structures within the city. Collapsed.
There's about a 7-inch gap on the north approach, and we're going to close this bridge.
I worry that I'll be kind of stuck where I am for a little while, and I think that's going to be true for many people who live on one side of the river but either work or have to take kids to school on the other side of the river.
As bad as this is, and as hard as it is to look into somebody's living room with dishes and shoes on the floor and things like that, Japan could be considered a success story. In Sumatra, we lost 750,000 people. Japan, on the other hand, was extremely well prepared. You know, this house is gone, but right over there, the bridge is still operating, the port is operating. In Oregon, we're at a bit of a crossroads. We're completely unprepared. And we can go down the route of Indonesia and just let it happen, or we can actually learn something from Japan and take the other road.
揺れがどれくらい揺れたか。
early part was about the geology and about the maps. And, now people understand that, and they're asking the question, I'm not a geologist, I'm just a regular person. What do I have to know for my life?
People need to understand that they will be on their own for more than just 3 days, in some cases up to 2 weeks, if not longer.
Yes, there's a danger, there is a bit of fear, but that fear can be transmuted into preparedness.
This ride is intended to simulate a supply run for the local neighborhood. Ooh.
Do you have a cargo bike? What does your neighbor need?
When a disaster comes and you can step up to the plate and help out, that's going to be where the rubber really meets the road.
This is my go bag. I have pure water. I have a warm body. That's 3 days. Don't let this overwhelm your life and overly cloud your life. But to have it be something that we know about, something that we've internalized, part of our being, like rain. We know to wear rain jackets even though the sun might be coming out.
This is not that difficult. It's education, awareness, and the will to do something about it.
Whoa. All right, there we go. That caught me by surprise. Let me go back over here. There we go. I see you, Jared.
Hey.
So just in conclusion, I think the awareness of being able to develop a plan of doing something, being engaged and using our resources, and starting. Once it's easier to ride a bike once you get the bike going than to sit there without it moving. And so that's what we're trying to do, is get things moving so that we can get a plan developed and have it applicable to our different wards, our different neighborhoods, or to our families, and be prepared in doing that. Brett, I know you're up there in Oak Ridge, and Oak Ridge is a lot different situation than we are down here in the valley. Blue River is the same thing, a lot different than down here in the valley. And talking with some people up there, just the communications is critical in being able to communicate. We have a big event up here, and Oak Ridge and Blue River are going to be isolated for a lot longer than we will be. And so their preparation may be a little bit different than ours, though the basics are the same. So I appreciate you all being on. I think we've got a couple minutes left. If anybody has any questions, you want to holler something out or a comment to make, that'd be great. You probably need to unmute yourself, maybe. See if I can figure out how to do this here. That's really good. I asked you to ask questions, and then
Everybody leaves.
Okay, now I think everybody's clear. So, any questions anybody has? Nope. Okay. Well, appreciate you guys being on, and this will be probably in the next little bit. Will be available on the YouTube channel. So thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. And we'll hope